If you try to fight that nobody's perfect premise, you are more likely to be met with contempt or mockery of them suggesting, oh, I get it. You think you're perfect. Then the whole conversation devolves into them painting you as a self-righteous believer in your own perfection. And it all gets really confusing really fast. It's a very, very tough argument to win.
So again, doing all these little short series, and one of the ones we've been taking on is this idea of the excuses that narcissists make for their own behavior. You got to know their excuses, but it's because sometimes by understanding their excuses, you're less likely to use them to drive your own justifications about their behavior. Because let me tell you, the only person that's a better justifier than a person stuck in a narcissistic relationship is the narcissists themselves. So have you ever heard a narcissist use this as an excuse? I got the goods. Now, you are welcome to start this with an eye roll, right? Like, I'm going to roll my eyes. Like, seriously, you got the goods? Despite all of that fragile insecurity, inadequacy, and shame, the narcissistic person's above the line belief comes off as that they really are all that. In fact, this is the core of grandiose narcissism: poor self-reflective capacity, poor insight, lack of accurate self-esteem, and the inability to see themselves accurately. For narcissistic folks, everything is transactional. I did this for you, you do this for me. And this extends to themselves as well. Because despite their poor self-reflective capacity, they do know what types of behavior are better received than others. In other words, a narcissistic person knows what nice looks like. It's just really a stretch for them to be nice because of their contempt, their shame, their impatience with other people, their fear of emotion. It makes it nothing short of impossible for them to be nice, because reflexively they're not, because they want what they want when they want it. So when they behave badly, which is a daily occurrence, and they can see that their behavior does affect how other people regard them, they become defensive, many times because they think they're going to lose narcissistic supply. And one of their first go-tos is this classical excuse, basically some variation on, I've got the goods. It could be, I make all the money. Or do you think you would really have such a nice life without me? Or who do you think in this company closes the most sales? Or this place would be nothing without me? Or I am the one. Listen, am I not the one who's earned the doctorate from Fancy Pants University? So let's be clear on who's smart here. It's all me. So their ability or their skill or some other quality in them is something that they view as an eternal get out of jail free card. And that rationalizes all of their behavior. Oh, what are you saying? People have a problem with my personality? To hell with them. I'm the one who's got the goods. It's basically, so if you want the benefits of me, then just adjust to me, because I've got the goods, right? This whole I've got the goods defense often exerts itself most often, frankly, in workplace scenarios. You will have the narcissistic, raging, inappropriate, power-hungry, one-person wrecking crew harassing tyrant at work. And sadly, they may actually be the one who keeps making the sales, getting the awards, etc., etc. Now, keep in mind, part of the reason that narcissistic people are so successful in workplace settings, particularly highly competitive workplace settings such as finance, law, media, academia, politics, is too often because of their marginal ethics and their willingness to break rules to get ahead. Throwing people under the bus is kind of a daily practice for narcissistic people. But whatever their backstory is on how they got to their eminent success, to the world, to the employer, to the clients, it looks like the narcissistic person is the one who is spinning everything into gold. And sadly, the enablers and the unaware often fall for it or view the abuse as sort of a natural hazing ritual that's part of being in this industry. However, I must say, in the current climate of accountability and movements such as Me Too, finally some of these toxic folks are kind of being called out for their abusive behavior a little bit. And for years, and even now, some of these narcissistic abusers continue to use defenses like, my words were taken out of context, or it's just the nature of the industry, and behind closed doors have always fallen back on, if you want to succeed in this industry, whatever that industry is, you have to be tough. And I've always delivered. I can't put up with a bunch of whiners. And in that way, the narcissists have now successfully pathologized the people around them who are having normal reactions to being verbally abused by minimizing them as weak and whiners. Now, narcissists who use this excuse, I got the goods, it's an extension of the larger societal enabling that is happening every day. In some ways, they do not need to say it because so many people let them get away with it implicitly for this reason. He's a genius. Let's just ignore his behavior. It's not a big deal. Or she's just temperamental, but she's the best in the game. Let's just get through this project. Or I know they're just demanding, but the work is impeccable. And people often enable narcissists on these grounds. The narcissist doesn't even need to make an excuse for themselves. Other people are doing it for them. And this creates a perpetual cycle of the narcissistic people spouting this nonsense about having the goods and everyone else believing it. Excellence does not need to be abusive. It's a myth, and it's a harmful myth at that. Nobody has that many goods that they can use these so-called goods as an excuse for tyrannical and cruel behavior. I don't care if you're Mozart wrapped up in Rembrandt or whatever tech guru du jour who invented whatever damn device or program or platform we use. I don't care what you've done. Abuse is still abuse. Having the goods is not enough. And the danger for all of us is that when we are told someone has the goods, or the narcissists tell us they have the goods, we may find ourselves accepting the abuse and even normalizing it. It's never normal. I don't know what it means you've got the goods. Usually it means that you've got something that involves a lot of money and a lot of power. Whatever those goods that they're talking about are, ultimately, if you're being treated badly, they can have all the damn goods in the world. It's not enough to keep putting your psyche up on the chopping block. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to put this to you as a question. Have you ever said to a narcissistic person, hey, can we like pull back a little bit, or whatever it is you might say, and they'll say something, hey, when you work at my level, you expect no less from others. And now you feel like the person is not working hard enough. So let's take on this excuse that narcissistic people make for their behavior, right? Because I've been talking about these excuses, and this has been a short series I've been doing of videos that take on all of these various excuses that narcissistic people make for their abusive behavior. In some ways, they're sort of self-enabling. Let's face it, narcissists are clearly at some level aware that not everyone is okay with how they conduct themselves. But that said, they don't change their behavior. Instead, they provide all kinds of excuses and justifications and rationalizations for their behavior. Now, today, we're going to talk about a common excuse that they often pull out of their hats for their often abusive behavior in relationships, in the workplace, etc. It is, when you work at my level, you expect no less from other people. Now, I'm going to be honest. One of my hobbies is actually to read the news, as much news coverage as I can, of bosses and boss-type people, celebrities, and other people who have a lot of power and who publicly then ultimately get called out for their abusive treatment of those who work usually in a more subordinate position to them. Oftentimes, these are people in sort of high visibility or high power professions like entertainment, finance, politics, high visibility, slick industries. Now, in the vein of Me Too, we now see that there's more of a voice and someone will finally speak out. And then we finally hear in the news the stories of harassment, assault, people throwing electronic devices at other people's heads, and people slamming stuff down, obsessive compulsive control of the office environment, public humiliation and degradation, employees quaking in fear and living with a litany of health issues after having had to work under these conditions. Then the whole post-mortem begins, right? And the layers of the onion begin to get peeled back. There will be those who were abused by this narcissistic person and who come out of the shadows and share their stories. And there will always be that small pocket of enablers who will defend or slightly defend what happened, saying things like, well, like, all right, let's face it, this company was so big because they had exacting standards. And they held themselves to these standards and had the pressure of carrying this excellence on them, which means that sometimes they were less than graceful. Well, that's a nice spin on it. The enablers would come up with gentle ways of framing the abuse. Again, putting lipstick on a pig. Abuse is abuse. But when it comes to the narcissistic abusers themselves, that is where the excuses become most fascinating. I have said this time and time again on this YouTube channel. Part of the reason we have such a systemic and global issue with narcissism is because narcissistic people are often extremely successful. They are often obsessive and exacting about details and work, and even about their work ethic. Because frankly, for narcissistic folks, work is a much easier, more consistent, and more predictable way to get narcissistic supply, money, and power than human relationships are. And if all of that goes well, if their work goes well, work brings money, which brings power. And as a result, they will rise to the top of organizations or begin their own organizations. And as leaders, they really work within the cult of personality. People are drawn to that, and they tend to build cult-like structures around them. There is sometimes a sort of culture that is characterized by revering and pushing for who can work the hardest. Like, oh, I work 20 hours, oh, I work 22. And these are often workplaces that have sort of hazing rituals naturally built into them. But the narcissistic person's success is often something that they hide behind, and sadly, is something that often draws people to them. Sort of like one of those big risky things that I hear, like a little like red flag I hear about, was when it comes to people who get harmed by extreme workplace narcissism, is the draw that they initially may have had to working in a prestigious or promising or otherwise fancy place, whether it be a company or a startup or a hospital or a university. There must be the hope that that fancy job might launch their dreams, make them rich, or prepare them for bigger and better things. They'll be able to say, hey, look, I worked at fancy place. And too often in these places, there are difficult, toxic folks. Yeah, they get the job done, but with a body count. Now, when the narcissistic abuser in these big cases, or honestly, even in the small cases, finally gets called out, they will issue an apology, maybe, or at least a mea culpa, right? Because their attorney or their publicist tells them to do so because it's better optics, and say something like, quote, I recognize that some of my behaviors may have caused discomfort for staff and employees. It was never my intention. This is a competitive industry, and I felt I was never asking them to do anything more than I was doing, but I can see now that my behavior was not considered acceptable. That kind of sort of canned apology. But stuck in there is that idea that I expected them to work the way I was doing it, work as hard as I was doing it, at the standards I was. Now, before people get caught in their behavior, let's say you actually try to take this up with the narcissistic person who's behaving like this. You may actually be hit with colleagues or leaders who will say, I'm not asking you to do anything more than I am. But these toxic leaders miss the point. Maybe these leaders are in fact working as hard or even harder than the other people. The difference is that these toxic people, that that the people who are getting hurt by this are having to work while being abused. The toxic leader has the luxury of working hard without a person invalidating, manipulating, and humiliating them. They get to be in control of how the workplace runs. Many of these stories will involve toxic leaders who are up before dawn and do some sort of weird pre-dawn rituals around eating bizarre things and insane workouts, and they send emails pre-dawn as well, and they're angry that people aren't responding even though it's 4 in the morning. They're angry that people aren't showing up and being available to them around the clock, and that aren't maintaining the narcissistic leader's obsessive zeal and devotion to this bizarre level of work and discipline. But this narcissistic excuse is not limited to the workplace. It is also an issue in families and relationships. A narcissistic person, for example, may shame their partner and say, "Hey, when you work as hard as I do, I expect nothing different from you." And that sort of rhetoric will be an excuse for them making unreasonable demands around the household. A narcissistic parent may have some sort of bizarre Calvinist work ethic and constantly invalidate and berate their children, their partner, or both for wanting to pursue their own interests, or at a minimum to just spend time in a more balanced manner or have some leisure time and tell them, "Hey, I expect you to do as much as I do." And that will then become an excuse for their verbal abuse, that you aren't working as hard as I do. I'm not asking you to do anything I don't do. Because narcissistic people are so outcome focused, for example, money, power, dominance, and they're very egocentric, they tend to take impeccable care of themselves, but at the expense of the others around them. They can be obsessive in everything they do, whether that's work or leisure. And because they view others as objects that exist for their gratification or for their needs, they do not take note of how their behavior is impacting other people's health and well-being. Shaming people for not producing, not working, not doing becomes their way of rationalizing abusive behavior in all kinds of relationships. This pattern also explains why many people will equate working hard with getting love. This idea of trying to measure up to an impossible and almost abusive demands for productivity, and then having that behavior excused by the narcissist's proclaimed hard work. "Hey, I work as hard as you do," is often just too much to bear. But maintaining that sad and hopeful belief that if I just do enough uncomplainingly, they will finally love you. They won't. For narcissistic people, all of us are just means to an end. It ends up becoming an abusive stew of shaming, their excusing of their own behavior, and magnifying our own sense of not being enough that makes this excuse uniquely painful. So the next time they say, "Hey, I'm not asking you to do anything I do," and then that becomes the excuse for their abusive treatment, abusive words, invalidation, throwing things, screaming at the workplace, again, all things unreasonable. It's again, there are no excuses for abuse. So when you hear this idea, "Well, I'm doing it, so you should do it," doesn't excuse the abuse. Maybe that they've set a tone for a work ethic. That tone can be set without harming other people.
Today, I want to start again. I love hearing from all of you. And if you could drop it in the chat, how many of you have heard that phrase, the phrase, "Nobody's perfect," from a person that you've been in a narcissistic relationship with? If you have heard this, please drop it in the chat, because I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of people endorsing this one. So let's unpack this issue. Okay, so nobody's perfect, right? Newsflash, nobody is perfect. So again, I want to hear from you. If any of you have ever heard this little phrase, "Nobody's perfect," from a narcissistic person in your life or from an enabler of a narcissist. My guess is that this is happening to all of us more often than not, in many, if not most, of our narcissistic relationships. So I want to help you understand that so you're better prepared for when it happens. So let's file nobody's perfect under the enabling phrases that end up gaslighting survivors of narcissistic abuse and pull more and more second chances out of people who are stuck in narcissistic relationships. And you know what the challenge is with this statement? Nobody's perfect. It's true. Nobody is perfect. Nobody's perfect. Nothing is perfect. Perfection is a nonsense word when it comes to understanding human beings and human relationships. So to say nobody's perfect is like saying the sun is hot or gravity makes things fall. Yeah, got it. It's kind of like, okay, very, very basic, right? But this phrase is often thrown about when the narcissistic person screws up, and they always screw up. All of us screw up, right? We all screw up in many small ways during our day. We forget an appointment. We put red socks in with the whites. We put the wrong date on something that we're signing. We pay the bill late. We burn the toast. Nobody's perfect, right? The issue is that this idea of nobody's perfect is also often thrown around in narcissistic relationships as a way of excusing big ticket mistakes like infidelity or major lies or betrayals or abusive, cruel words or behaviors like, I slept with your best friend. Nobody's perfect. Or I sent a naked selfie to my assistant. Nobody's perfect. Or I lied about how much money I lost on that investment. Nobody's perfect. Okay, yeah, it was wrong to insult you and call you a bad mother. Nobody's perfect. Yeah, no. Sadly, the nobody's perfect defense really works very well because the phrase itself is true. But what it does is it deflects the focus off of the bad, entitled, unempathic, or deceitful behavior and moves it over to this universal truism that nobody's perfect. The problem is that most people in narcissistic relationships are quite empathic and more than willing to try to see both sides of a situation. So when they are hit with the nobody's perfect defense and couple that up with some trauma bonding, it works. It provides the narcissistic person with a quick justification. The fight moves away from the lie or the abuse or the deceit or the behavior, and it moves over to a discussion of nobody's perfect. It puts you in a catch-22 because right out the gate, you sort of lose the fight. If you say something like, well, that's not true, I'm perfect, well, that's not going to fly because you're not perfect either. If you try to fight that nobody's perfect premise, you are more likely to be met with contempt or mockery of them suggesting, oh, I get it, you think you're perfect. Then the whole conversation devolves into them painting you as a self-righteous believer in your own perfection. And it all gets really confusing really fast. It's a very, very tough argument to win. The bigger problem with the nobody's perfect of all of it is that other people get on the nobody's perfect bandwagon as well. Friends who are trying to give you advice, therapists, other folks you may turn to, other observers or enablers who are in your midst. And as a result, you hit the nobody's perfect justification all around after the narcissist does something bad, which can leave many survivors feeling or being portrayed as though they're being unreasonable for wanting to sort of unbraid this lie or understand it or understand the betrayal or expect some self-reflection or accountability by the narcissistic person for what they did rather than the tired old nobody's perfect. Perfectionism is such an interesting issue in narcissism. In their grandiosity, they actually hold perfectionism as a possible goal. They strive for perfection. They unreasonably expect perfectionism. They have fantasy visions of what people and situations can look like or be like, and will berate other people, their family members, their employees, their partners, for not being perfect. That's why the nobody's perfect defense can really, really be so grating. When they finally do pull out a phrase to talk about their betrayal, it's not from a place of true vulnerability, but from a place of blame shifting. Big surprise, right? So what do you do with the nobody's perfect of it all in your narcissistic relationships? You have to see the behavior of the other person in a relationship of any kind, whether they're narcissistic or not, in a context. Is this behavior, this bad behavior, repeated, or is it a one-time transgression? After making the mistake, is the other person in that relationship making a genuine effort to change? Or do they keep making the mistake over, or doing the bad thing over and over again, and keep shrugging and saying, I don't know, nobody's perfect? How much of a violation was their behavior? Was it a breach of trust or abuse that caused harm to you and others around you? Think about these things when you really take in that behavior. And always remember the power of the word "and" in the narcissistic relationship. It can be such a useful tool to push back on cognitive dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that's raised by moments like when somebody says, nobody's perfect. So things like, yeah, you're right, nobody's perfect. And you lied to me. Or, yeah, I got it. Nobody's perfect. And you betrayed my trust. Or, nobody's perfect. And that was abusive. Got to have that and. You can still have the nobody's perfect. Hook it into the behavior. You can preserve the universal truth of nobody's being perfect, again, and stay focused on the behavior, because that's the issue. Not that there's much point. The gaslighting, the denial, the justification, and the blame shifting, that's going to be the most likely scenario in any conversation with a narcissistic person, always. And maybe that's the one thing that's perfect. It lands the same way every time. I hope that's helpful, and thanks again.